Hello, dear reader. I'm Echo. I am the narrator of this story. This is Chapter 2 of the Red Taste Crenshaw verse. If you haven't read Chapter 1, congratulations. You haven't missed anything worthwhile. Without further ado, let's see what a silly story the writer wrote this time. It's early in the morning. Crenshaw has finished making a pile of donuts and sets a plate full of them on his bakery counter. What will be the transformation theme in this story? Spoiler alert, it won't be a dish transformation. Crenshaw looks down at his donuts proudly. After all that hard work, he can't wait for all of his customers to try his donuts and praise him for how good a cook he is. Yep. In this Crenshaw verse, Crenshaw, the extraordinarily perverted, powerful, and creepy demon, wants to be a cook. He has a very sensitive temperament too, but I'm sure we'll see that part soon. Just as Crenshaw is admiring his culinary work, the door to his bakery swings open to reveal the first customer of the day. Banjo stands in the doorway for a moment, breathing the aromas of the bakery before Crenshaw smiles widely and beckons him in. As the man approaches the counter, he returns the handsome baker's smile and lowers himself onto a rotatable stool at the counter. Banjo introduces himself and asks for a coffee and a sandwich to help settle his stomach from a long night of drinking. As the baker turns his back to prepare the coffee, Banjo begins to spin slowly on his stool, taking in the wonders of the bakery around him. The rich smell of coffee spreads through the air, and Banjo breathes a deep sigh of relief. As he waits for the baker to finish his order, the drunk man continues to swivel on his stool, his still tipsy brain delighted as he spins faster and faster, tucking his legs in to avoid knocking his knees against the counter. Crenshaw swiftly places a full cup of coffee in front of the spinning man and turns back to work on the sandwich. As Banjo reaches to grab the coffee, he miscalculates. Classic drunk mistake. And his arm knocks into the plate of sugared donuts, sending half a dozen of them tumbling off the counter. The loud clattering of the donut plate prompts Crenshaw to turn around. Banjo, embarrassed by his mistake, leaps off his stool with the intention of picking up the donuts. Unfortunately, in his haste, the drunk and stupid man accidentally sets his foot right on one of the donuts, crushing it and sending the cream filling squirting all over the floor. Crenshaw's eyes begin to glow red, the demon's fury ignited over the careless destruction of one of his careful creations. Banjo blushes a deep red and stammers an apology as he leans down to try to scrape the crushed donut off the floor. But his words fall on deaf ears as tendrils of red mist begin to seep from Crenshaw's body and pool around his feet. Like I said, very sensitive temperament. The sight of Crenshaw's glowing red eyes and the strange mist sends fear trickling down Banjo's spine. The man scrambles backward, away from the mess of donuts on the floor, as he watches the enraged baker exit from behind the counter and begin to approach him. A sudden surge of terror grips Banjo as those red eyes get closer, and in a burst of energy, the drunken man heaves himself up off the floor, hurtles out the bakery's front door, and slams it behind him. Panting in fear and desperation, Banjo looks around frantically for help. He spots a man across the street, standing next to a tricycle and dressed in nothing but a diaper and bib. In terror, Banjo rushes over to him, waving his arms and shouting nonsense about evil bakers. The man looks back at Banjo with wide eyes and takes the lollipop out of his mouth to answer. But from behind them, Banjo hears a sudden peal of wicked laughter. The sound of it cuts through the air and through him unlike anything he's ever felt before. And in a panic, Banjo shoves the man to the side and leaps on his tricycle. The man begins to scream in protest. He leans all of his body weight into pedaling and begins to race away from the horrifying red-eyed baker, who is now nearly upon them. The screaming protests of the man trail off as Crenshaw reaches him, and he notices the red mist emanating from the furious baker's body. In confusion and shock, the man stammers out a plea for help to Crenshaw, pointing toward Banjo wheeling away on his stolen tricycle. Without a response, Crenshaw snatches the lollipop from the big baby's hand and continues walking toward Banjo. The man-baby raises his eyebrows in surprise, but before he can say anything, the red mist swells up around him, blanketing him in an overwhelming urge to sleep. A peaceful look crosses the man's face, and he slumps to the ground, happily sucking his thumb. Banjo glances back over his shoulder and sees Crenshaw following him at a steady walk. The baker's red eyes set Banjo's heart racing in fear, and the man leans even harder into his pedaling until he begins to pull away at last from Crenshaw. Stopping abruptly, Crenshaw raises a single hand, and red mist begins to collect and accumulate in small, dense areas around him. As he reaches his hands toward Banjo, tendrils of red mist shoot suddenly from the crimson pools and snake toward him through the air. Despite this, Crenshaw realizes that Banjo is somehow faster on his tricycle than the demon's tendrils of magic fog. The demon baker rolls the lollipop between his fingers thoughtfully and pops it into his mouth. Smiling at the taste of the candy, Crenshaw drags his fingers backward through the air toward him, and his tendrils of red mist begin to retract. Wait, I've read something like this before. Is this a lazy, poorly made copy of the great story in Chapter 3 of the Freak Animals Crenshaw verse? Huh, okay. Well, I hope there's at least a copy of the interesting part about the scary red mist creature. Moving on. As the tendrils finish retracting into the growing pools of red mist, Crenshaw's eyes glow more brightly and the fog begins to accumulate and condense into a handful of smaller concentrated areas. Several pairs of glowing red eyes open in the densest areas of the red mist behind Crenshaw. Oh, how exciting! Will Crenshaw summon several creatures? This is starting to look good. The dense clusters of red mist begin to split into several foggy forms that wobble amorphously for a moment before solidifying into flying forks. Wait, the red mist creatures of this Crenshaw verse are flying forks? Really? Ugh. Okay, I got it. This Crenshaw verse is all about food, so the creatures take the form of cutlery. Wow, that's so stupid. Moving on. Crenshaw points his finger at Banjo and orders his stupid creatures to chase his target. The flying forks twitch in affirmation and zoom off through the air toward the fleeing man. Still pedaling hard and panting in fear, Banjo decides to risk another glance over his shoulder. When he does, he sees several tiny crimson shapes hurtling toward him through the air, ribbons of red mist curling off of them as they fly. Banjo narrows his eyes, trying to figure out what he's seeing, when the front wheel of his tricycle collides with a small stone. He veers suddenly and tumbles off the tricycle onto the ground. Who falls to the ground riding a tricycle? Congratulations, drunk! As Banjo tries to heave himself up from the ground, the flying forks zip toward him. The drunk man loses his balance and collapses again. He looks back again toward his pursuers and, realizing that the red shapes hurtling through the air are nearly upon him, panics and flees on foot. His panting, desperate flight is quickly ended when the swarm of flying forks engulf him. Banjo gasps and holds his arms up to cover his face in fear as the creatures begin to use their special ability. Poke Crenshaw's target. I'm such a good narrator. I deserve to narrate a better story. Sorry, I'm just venting. Banjo continues to struggle with the creatures, slapping at them with his hands and wincing as their sharp edges catch his skin. The flying forks continue to poke him until he is breathing heavily, and each resisting slap comes a little slower than the one before. As Banjo finally gives in and leans down to rest his hands on his knees and catch his breath, a group of the flying forks gathers into a swirling mass. Their bodies begin to merge, forming a large, dense area of red mist. Crenshaw steps through the crimson fog like a portal. Still sucking on his lollipop, the demon glares menacingly at Banjo. As he twitches his fingers, the red mist swells toward the terrified, drunk man, now slumping and too exhausted to resist the stupid creature stupidly poking him. A smile slides across Crenshaw's face, and the red mist surges up around Banjo, completely engulfing him. Transformation time! At least that means this clowning is almost over. Within the red mist, Banjo begins to float. His eyes go wide as he feels himself being lifted off the ground, and his clothes evaporate from his body, merging with the red mist that surrounds him. He feels a pressure from the red mist, pushing and pulling at his body. Wait. I don't think this is an appropriate transformation song for this. It should be more tense. Okay, better. I'll start again. Within the red mist, Banjo begins to float. His eyes go wide as he feels himself being lifted off the ground, and his clothes evaporate from his body, merging with the red mist that surrounds him. He feels a pressure from the red mist pushing and pulling at his body. Banjo's eyes go wide in disbelieving horror as his torso begins to expand sideways and his limbs begin to retract. He flexes his fingers and toes in terror as he watches them dwindle away, melting into his shrinking limbs until only small, twitching stumps remain. In a full panic, Banjo tries to thrash and buck to save himself, but all he's able to do is wiggle his 4 little stumps helplessly as the red mist continues its work on his body. The pressure around him intensifies as his head and neck begin to stretch wider, sinking slowly into his broadened body. Wow, this is long. Banjo can't believe what is happening to him, can't bring himself to face the reality of his situation. Blah, blah, blah. He desperately tries to move, but he realizes he has no control of his body anymore. Blah, 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 blah. Then, from outside the dense blanket of mist surrounding the transforming man, Crenshaw's eyes flare intensely red, and Banjo feels his navel begins to shift. It drags upward across his stomach, rising to the center of the torso, where it deepens, furrowing into Banjo's body like dough until it pierces through him, leaving his body with a hole right through the middle of his rounding body. The hole begins to expand, widening until Banjo's body is stretched around it like a ring. The texture and color of baked dough ripple across the man's skin, and he begins to shrink in size, dwindling until he's small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. The red mist disappears. Banjo is left lying on the floor, immobile and tiny, completely transformed into a donut. As he twists his eyes to look upward, he sees Crenshaw grinning down at him. The demon baker's hand closes around Banjo, and he feels himself ascending through the air. Crenshaw holds Banjo up in front of him and smiles again. The donut tries to scream, but quickly realizes he's completely immobile and mute, unable even to twitch his stumps or whimper for mercy. With Banjo's humiliating transformation nearly complete, Crenshaw walks calmly back across the street and into his bakery, where he heads behind the counter and begins rummaging around through his baking equipment. Still clutched in Crenshaw's hand, Banjo watches helplessly as the demon baker sprinkles sparkling sugar over his newly warped body and pulls a piping bag out from his apron pocket. He winks at his victim, and Banjo screams silently as he feels the baker shove the piping bag inside him and fills him with cream, and I refuse to say through where. Crenshaw's fingers tighten around Banjo, and he lifts the donut to his mouth and takes a big bite. The demon chuckles to himself as Banjo, in horror, watches the cream ooze out of his own body. Finally satisfied, Crenshaw places Banjo on top of the remaining donuts on the plate as the red glow leaves his eyes. At that moment, the bakery door opens and another customer enters. When he reaches the counter, he nods at Crenshaw and asks for a glass of orange juice. The baker smiles and turns his back to prepare the juice. As the new customer walks toward the counter chair, Crenshaw remembers that he had forgotten to gather the untrampled donuts from the floor. A squelching noise fills the air suddenly, and the customer raises his hands in guilt. He stammers out an apology as Crenshaw whips around with his eyes glowing a wicked shade of red. Seriously? Crenshaw is a terrible entrepreneur. This bakery will go bankrupt if Crenshaw keeps turning his customers into food.